In this session of our Introduction to Grammar course, we want to talk about English today and continue this discussion of English changes from Old English to Middle English and early modern English, and talk about some of the ways that English has changed more recently. We want to talk about who owns English, who gets to decide what English is and what's considered correct English or maybe incorrect or non-standard English. We'll also take a look at some specific examples of how English has changed in recent years, and then maybe make some predictions about how English could change in the future. When I gave a TEDx talk at SUU a couple of years ago, I asked this question, who owns English, during my talk. And it was within the context of talking about the most commonly spoken languages in the world. And English isn't necessarily the most commonly spoken language in the world in terms of native speakers. There's lots of speakers of Spanish, Mandarin Chinese dialects, also dialects on the Indian subcontinent. But English is, without a doubt, the most commonly spoken additional language for people. And in fact, unlike all these other languages that are very populous around the world, they don't have very many second language speakers. They have far more native speakers. English, it's the opposite. In comparison to its non-native speakers, there's just so many more, maybe 2 or 3 times as more non-native speakers of English compared to native English speakers of English. So this raises some interesting questions that we'll explore over the next few weeks about what is English, who decides what is English, and what are the different types of English around the world. But just keep this in mind and think about this over the next few weeks about this question of who owns English or who's the boss. Let's talk now about some types of changes that have happened to English more recently. We've talked about all these historic changes, but there are examples of pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary changes to English, even within recent decades. And I'll share a few examples from my experience. One of them is when I first came to the United States as an international student. It was a study abroad in Hawaii. And certainly no one commented on my variety of English because it's a very multicultural environment in Hawaii. Lots of different types of both native English varieties and non-native English varieties. But I remember being in my first linguistics class there in Hawaii, and these 2 words were presented. I don't know about you, but for me, these 2 words are homophones, meaning that they are pronounced the exact same, caught and caught. But in our class, not everyone pronounced these 2 words the same. Some people pronounce the first word, and this is a little bit hard for me to pronounce this vowel sound because it doesn't exist in my variety of English. It's more like caught and caught. There is no caught sound in my variety of English. It is a vowel sound that has disappeared for most American English speakers. They're contrasting sounds. We call these minimal pairs. And some varieties of English on the East Coast still have this distinction, but most don't. And certainly as you move west, this distinction it's not there. So this was an interesting indication to me that I spoke a variety of English that wasn't the same as all people in North America. And that my variety of English actually had less variety in vowel sounds than that of other speakers in the United States. It doesn't really matter because these 2 words are used very differently. And so even though I don't pronounce caught and caught differently, I say caught for both, context helps distinguish the meaning. So just keep this in mind. Many years later, when I was back living in the United States, and I had graduated from graduate school and I worked on the East Coast, I was interacting with a coworker who suggested that I talk to someone from another department whose name was Wendy. And I took that advice, but I thought, wow, that is so strange. What an unusual name, Wendy. And I came home and I mentioned it to my wife that I was told to contact someone whose name was Wendy. And my wife looked at me a little strange, like, what's so weird about that? And I said, well, Wendy, that's a little bit unusual, like a name like the weather, like the wind. And she says, oh, no, her name isn't Wendy. It's got to be Wendy. And I said, you just said the same thing. And she says, no, Wendy, like in Peter Pan and Wendy. And I said, well, that's not Wendy, that's Wendy. Those are two different sounds. These are minimal pairs. There's the Windy and there's the Wendy. And that's, I had been married a couple of years and had not realized that my wife from the East Coast doesn't generally make a distinction between those two vowel sounds, the I and the eh. She says pin for both a sewing implement and pin for a writing implement, where I would make the distinction with a pin and a pen. And I got really disturbed by this and said, that's really important distinction between the eh and the I. Until my mind, I realized, and I thought back to that difference between the quote and the caught, and how I don't make a distinction, and I do just fine, and everyone who speaks my dialect gets along just fine. But it helped me realize, and I did more research to realize that this is true. This is a distinction that's disappearing from many East Coast dialects, the difference between what we might consider a short I and a short E sound. Just as in the West, the difference between the sort of that AU and the O sound has merged. So these are things that are changing right now in English. Pronunciation merging or pronunciation shifting. If you go to the Midwest, you might hear people who talk about a tool, a noun for holding things, as a bag or as a bag. I would pronounce that a bag. But in some regions of the United States, that ah sound is changing more towards an or an sound. And so we're seeing these vowel shifts also in some parts of the United States. And this is just a thing that continues to happen. Pronunciation shifts, just as we had learned about with Old English, Middle English, and early modern English, pronunciation shifts, and they're still happening today. And these things will continue to happen. Let's talk about some grammar, interesting changes to grammar. When I was working as a graduate student for a test making department, we had to write multiple choice tests, and we would meet regularly, talk about maybe standards, kind of like we might do with technical writing, and have a copy Bible, sort of a list of standards of how you would use grammar and punctuation and other terms. And the issue came up of using a third person singular gender neutral pronoun. We don't have that in English. Some languages do. In English, we have he, she. We do have it, but it is for a non-person. And so we can't make reference to he or she, or we have to make reference to he or she when we're talking about a third person singular person. And one of the other people who was working on the project, who had been an editing student, said, well, let's just use they. Let's agree to use they. And I felt really offended by that. I'm like, oh, that is so informal, and that's not good to use at all. And let's just avoid that at all costs, and either use plural if we have to, or just choose a gender and go with that. And that's how I left the meeting, feeling kind of self-righteous with my grammar choice there. Until a week or two later, we were coming and reviewing our items. And before we talked about them, I was just reviewing my own items, and I realized I had done the exact same thing that I said we shouldn't do. I had used they as a third person singular gender neutral pronoun for an unknown person. So we didn't know whether the person was male or female, and so I had used they. And it made me realize that even though I know I use that all the time in my speech, I also was using it in my writing. And why was I complaining that that was bad grammar, or that grammar shouldn't change that way? In fact, I've learned since then that even writers like Jane Austen, more than 100 years ago, were using they as a third person gender neutral pronoun when we don't know the gender of the person that we're talking about in more abstract terms, maybe. This brings up an interesting question, or an interesting topic. When we talked about structure class words recently, we had said we almost never add new words to a structure class. it's a closed class. Now the form classes, we can add new nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs to a language, but adding new things like new prepositions or new pronouns almost never, ever happens in a language. And so there has been a push culturally to find a third person singular gender neutral pronoun for maybe people who don't identify in the binary categories that we have of male and female. And the truth is, we don't need to invent a new one. Some people have tried to proposing new ones like a thur or a hish or something, but we've already got it. We've got they. Now we've been using it for decades as when we don't know the gender of someone and it's more of an abstract kind of reference. Like if someone has forgotten their book, they should go to the lost and found. We don't know if someone is male or female, but we can also use they in these situations now where we do know the person isn't a question, but that person is either choosing to identify as non-binary or that person wants to remain ambiguous as to their gender, and they functions very well. And so that's the way that our grammar is changing, okay? That we're becoming more open to using third person singular gender neutral for a variety of situations. When the person's unknown, but also when the person is known, but we don't want to have to make that gender distinction. Let's talk about some vocabulary changes. Lots of new technology words. Words that did not exist when I was born or even graduated high school, now we use frequently every day. Things like Wi-Fi and blog and even internet didn't exist 50 years ago, but now we use them all the time, and we're constantly inventing new words. The business field that often gets criticized for coming up with new and strange verbs, where they take nouns and they make them verbs, and sometimes people complain and, oh, what is our grammar coming to? But this is nothing new. English has been doing this forever, and we will continue to do it. And it's just a way that English is continuing to evolve and adapt so that our language fits our needs as a society and a group. I did want to talk about a couple of these words. When I first came to study in the United States in that same linguistics class, I heard a student, and to you this may not seem remarkable at all, but it did to me back then. I heard a student refer to another student by saying, oh, he is so random. Now, previous says I had never heard the word random used to describe a person. Random was used to describe numbers. Random meant non-predictable number. It does not follow a pattern. But to have it associated with a person made me think of the person was like a computer or a mathematical problem. But here they were taking this word and using it in a new context. And that's one of the realities of language, is that language can be used in new ways. That same person used this word with. Now, I think of with as a preposition. A preposition usually can't exist on its own. A preposition needs to exist with a phrase. So I will go with my friends. So with and then my friends, we need that part there. Or I will cook with oil, okay, and I need the oil part. But this same person in the linguistics class had used the word with more like an adverb. Hey, do you want to come with? And not come with us. That's how I would speak. But she was using it not as a preposition, but as an adverb. Whereas I would probably say that phrase, do you want to come along? And then you can use along as an adverb. But here I was seeing language change happening where English speakers are deciding with doesn't just have to be a preposition. We can use it as an adverb that means along. In fact, just this past week in my French class here on campus, the instructor used this when she was describing something briefly in English, and she said, you want to come with? And another reminder to me that English is evolving and changing. Let's talk about some future changes. This word here, how would you categorize it? What word category would you put this word in? Research. Okay, we often will think of two places. We can use this as a verb, to research, maybe to research cancer, or to research a problem. We can also use it as a noun, or we talk about she conducted research, or he's doing research. But when we use it as a noun, we use it as a non-count noun, which means we can't really put a count determiner in front of it. We can't say a research, or I did 2 researches. We would say instead maybe a research study. Except English speakers do this, particularly non-native speakers. I have read numerous articles that are published in international English journals where researchers and writers will say, one research done by this group, or research by these, there are two researches by this group. Now, as a native speaker of English, this is jarring to me because my internal grammar says this is a non-count noun, you can't do that. But the more English is going to be owned by people who are non-native speakers of English, they're not going to worry about whether a noun is count noun or non-noun. They're going to count it because in their brain you can count it, or because in their language they have a similar word which is a count noun, and so they can do that and they apply that rule to English. And that's just one of the ways that English is going to change in the future, is that we're going to see more influence from non-native speakers changing the way we think about words and how we use words. And so things that may seem so strange to us today, in 20, 50 years, could be very different the way we use certain words and grammatical principles in English. So we talked a little bit today, not about these topics, I forgot to update this, but we talked about how, who owns English. We talked about some of the changes that English has undergone recently, and we also talked about how we think English could change in the future. And I hope this will give you some ideas about what is English grammar and how is English grammar going to continue to change.